In the brutal, high-altitude ballet of the European Air War, a certain aesthetic had been established, a dogma of death dictated by the sleek, predatory forms of the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt. These were machines of grace, of slender wings and finely tuned lines, designed to cut through the thin, cold air where bombers flew. They were the embodiment of a philosophy that valued agility above all else, the swift, sharp fang of the intercept. And then, there was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. When it first appeared in the skies over occupied Europe in 1943, it did not so much enter the theater as crash onto the stage. To the German pilots who first glimpsed it through their canopies, it was an apparition, a grotesque parody of a fighter plane. It was massive. This was its first, its most undeniable characteristic. With a fuselage that was little more than a vast cylinder and a wingspan that seemed better suited to a medium bomber, the Thunderbolt dwarfed every single-engine fighter it flew alongside. It weighed 7 tons, fully loaded. It could tip the scales at nearly 8, making it heavier than some twin-engine light bombers. A Luftwaffe pilot, accustomed to the lean, almost racecar-like profile of his Bf-109, could be forgiven for thinking he was seeing a new enemy bomber, perhaps a stunted and misguided one. The initial German intelligence assessments, pieced together from grainy reconnaissance photos and the frantic, confused reports of first encounters, were dismissive, laced with a palpable sense of condescension. They gave it a nickname, born from its blunt, rounded nose and rotund fuselage, Die Jug, the Jug. It was a term of derision, comparing the colossal American fighter to a common, heavy, earthenware milk pitcher. The implication was clear: it was clumsy, uncouth, a blunt instrument in a duel of rapiers. How could this behemoth, this flying milk jug, possibly hope to tangle with the agile products of German engineering? The very laws of physics, they believed, were on their side. This dismissal was rooted in a deeper, more profound cultural and technical arrogance. German engineering, from the automotive to the aeronautical, was celebrated for its precision, its complexity, and its pursuit of an almost artistic perfection. A Daimler-Benz engine was a symphony of interlocking parts, a masterpiece of miniaturization and power density. A Focke-Wulf fuselage was a study in aerodynamic purity. Their fighters were extensions of a philosophy that prized the knife fight, the close-in, turning dogfight where finesse and quickness decided the victor. To the German mind, a fighter was a scalpel. The American Thunderbolt, by stark contrast, appeared to be a sledgehammer. It represented an entirely different, and to the Germans, a seemingly crude, industrial philosophy. Where German design was elegant, the P-47 was brutally functional. Its very shape was dictated not by a quest for beauty, but by the sheer, uncompromising bulk of its power plant, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine. This 18-cylinder Leviathan was the heart of the beast, a power plant of such immense displacement and potential that it demanded a fuselage large enough to contain it and a propeller massive enough to harness its fury. The Thunderbolt wasn't so much designed around the engine as it was built onto it. The early combat reports seemed to confirm the German prejudice. The P-47s, with their tremendous weight, were sluggish in a climb. They could not turn with a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf at lower altitudes. A German pilot who found one on his tail could often outmaneuver it with a tight, banking turn, watching the great jug wallow through the sky, unable to match the rate. These initial, successful evasions were reported back with confidence. The American plane was a failure, a testament to the inability of the New World to grasp the subtle art of air combat. They were producing quantity, to be sure, but it was a clumsy, inferior quantity. What the German pilots and intelligence analysts failed to grasp in these early days was that they were judging the P-47 by their own rulebook, a rulebook the Thunderbolt's designers had never read. They saw its inability to perform in a low-altitude turning fight as a fundamental flaw. They did not yet understand that the P-47 was not built for the knife fight, it was built for the joust. Its design priorities were not agility, but speed, power, dive performance, and survivability. The very weight they mocked was the key to its devastating dive. The massive size they laughed at would soon be revealed as a shell protecting an unprecedented array of armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a robust airframe that could absorb punishment that would tear a lighter fighter apart. And so, in the winter of 1943, the legend of the Thunderbolt began not with a fanfare of triumph, but with a chorus of enemy derision. It was their unlikely legend, a machine so outwardly wrong, so contrary to established wisdom, that its enemies could not conceive of its true purpose. It was a sledgehammer waiting for the right nail. And soon, in the cold, thin air high above the Reich, where the B-17 flying fortresses roamed and the German defenders fought for every breath, the sledgehammer would finally find its swing. The Germans had dismissed the Jug as a clumsy fool. They were about to learn that it was, in fact, a titan. The sky over Europe was more than a battlefield, it was a canvas upon which two opposing industrial and philosophical doctrines were painted in contrails and fire. To understand the German shock at the P-47 Thunderbolt, one must first understand the machine they were expecting, the paradigm from which their own aircraft sprang. It was a paradigm of exquisite, almost obsessive, refinement, a school of thought where engineering was an art form and performance was a god to be worshipped, often at any cost. German aircraft design in the Second World War was the culmination of a century-long tradition of scientific and technical excellence. It was a culture that revered the diplom engineer, the master engineer, whose genius lay in extracting the absolute maximum performance from a given set of physical constraints. This philosophy produced machines that were, on paper and often in the air, breathtaking. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a masterpiece of minimalism and power. Its liquid-cooled, inverted, V12 Daimler-Benz engine was a symphony of mechanical complexity, offering a phenomenal power-to-weight ratio. The airframe was sleek, the wings small and efficient, the entire machine a razor-honed for the single, swift cut of the boom and zoom attack or the tight, turning jewel. This pursuit of performance, however, came with an inherent set of compromises the German design philosophy was willing to accept. To save weight and reduce drag, every ounce of material was scrutinized. This resulted in airframes that were light and agile, but also notoriously fragile. The Bf 109's narrow-track, inward-retracting landing gear, while aerodynamically clean, was a deathtrap for novice pilots, leading to countless ground loops and accidents. The aircraft's operational range was notoriously short, a flying pencil that could only stab at the enemy before rushing back to its base. It was a qualitative weapon, designed to achieve local air superiority through technical brilliance and pilot skill. It was a precision instrument, and like a precision instrument, it was intolerant of rough handling, poor maintenance, or inexperienced operators. This ethos extended to the legendary jet and rocket aircraft that emerged later in the war. The Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, was a quantum leap in performance. Yet, its revolutionary Jumo 00 for turbojet engines had a recommended overhaul life of a mere 25 hours. They were temperamental, vulnerable to throttle surges that could incinerate the engine, and constructed with strategic materials like nickel and cobalt in such short supply that substitutes were used, further compromising reliability. The machine was a flash of genius, a glimpse into the future, but it was a future built on a foundation that was cracking. It was the ultimate expression of the German philosophy: achieve the performance goal, no matter the logistical or operational cost. Across the Atlantic, a different industrial religion was being practiced. American engineering was not born from a tradition of royal courts and master craftsmen, but from the vast, open spaces of a continent that demanded ruggedness and the production lines of Detroit that demanded standardization. The American philosophy was not about creating the perfect individual instrument, but about creating a system that could produce, deploy, and sustain a winning weapon. The core tenets were not finesse, but force, not elegance, but endurance. The American approach was one of over-engineering from the German perspective. Where the Germans sought to minimize, the Americans sought to reinforce. An American fighter did not need to be perfect, it needed to be effective. And effectiveness in a global war, the U.S. Army Air Forces understood, was measured by more than just a top speed or turn rate. It was measured by how many hours a day it could fly, how far it could fly to reach a target, how much damage it could absorb from enemy fire and still return home, and how easily a 19-year-old mechanic with 9 months of training could fix it in a muddy field. This philosophy prioritized 3 pillars: ruggedness, survivability, and overwhelming power. Ruggedness meant airframes that could withstand forces that would tear a more delicate machine apart. It meant wide, sturdy landing gear that could be slammed onto rough, forward airstrips. It meant control systems with a margin of safety built in, forgiving to a rookie pilot's panicked input. Survivability was paramount. This meant armor plate behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks that could plug holes from 20mm cannon fire, and redundant control cables. A German pilot might be protected by his aircraft's agility, an American pilot was protected by the sheer, brute toughness of his machine. Overwhelming power was the American answer to complexity. While German engineers sought to extract every last horsepower through intricate mechanical systems, American engineers simply built a bigger engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was the apotheosis of this. It was not a lightweight, high-strung racing engine, it was a radial behemoth, a hammer that delivered immense, reliable torque. Its complexity was managed not by delicate tolerances, but by its sheer size and robustness. It was designed to run hard, for a long time, and to be maintained by mechanics who valued a standard wrench set over a master's degree in engineering. When these two philosophies finally clashed in the skies, the initial encounters were misleading. The German pilot, in his agile, finely tuned machine, could dance around the American. He saw a clumsy, heavy aircraft. What he failed to see was the system it represented, an aircraft built not for a single, elegant duel, but for the long, brutal war of attrition that was to come. The German designed a scalpel. The American was building an anvil. And soon, the scalpel would find that striking the anvil repeatedly only resulted in its own, inevitable breakage. The air over northern France on that overcast morning in late 1943 was a lethal tapestry, woven with the contrails of B-17 formations and the slashing attacks of German interceptors. In this chaos, a single Republic P-47D of the 56th Fighter Group, nicknamed Slick Chick, found itself in a fight for its life. Flown by a young pilot, Lieutenant Ken "Chip" Collins, the Thunderbolt had just broken off from escorting the battered bombers back towards the Channel when a lucky, ranging burst from a Focke-Wulf FW-190's 20mm cannon found its mark. It wasn't a killing blow, but it was a crippling one. The shell fragment did not ignite the fuel tank, thanks to its self-sealing design, but it severed a critical oil line. A dark, viscous stream began to plume behind the massive fighter, and the instrument panel's oil pressure gauge began a steady, sickening dive towards zero. In the cockpit, Collins fought the controls. The rumble of the Double Wasp engine began to change, losing its deep-throated roar and acquiring a metallic, grinding whine. The smell of scorched oil seeped into the cockpit. He knew the signs. The engine was eating itself alive, and he had minutes, perhaps seconds, before it seized completely, turning his aircraft into an 8-ton glider. The Channel was too far. The only choice was the enemy-held ground below. He keyed his MIC, his voice tight but clear, "Mayday, Mayday, Slick Chick is hit. Oil pressure 0. Going down. Coordinates." The response from his wingman was a crackle of static and a desperate, "Godspeed, Ken." The forced landing was a testament to both the pilot's skill and the Thunderbolt's inherent ruggedness. Collins, unable to maintain altitude for a proper approach, picked a relatively flat field, wrestling the deadweight aircraft down. The massive frame tore through a hedgerow, the wide landing gear digging into the soft earth. It slewed violently, collapsing one gear leg and shredding a wingtip, but the cockpit structure held. Dazed but unhurt, Collins scrambled out, intent on lighting the fire with his survival kit matches before a German patrol arrived. But the enemy was already there. A Wehrmacht unit, having watched the crippled giant descend, was upon him in minutes. His Zippo had barely sparked before he found himself staring down the barrels of Mauser rifles. His war was over. For the German soldiers, this was a curiosity of immense value. They had seen the wreckage of aircraft before, but this was different. This was not a shattered, burning carcass. This was a nearly intact specimen of the enemy's latest and most formidable escort fighter. The local commander, recognizing the intelligence coup, immediately cordoned off the area. Within hours, the news traveled up the chain of command. bypassing regular army channels and finding its way to the desks of the Technisches Amt, Technical Office, of the Rijksluchtvaartministerium, Rij Air Ministry. The order came back, crisp and unequivocal: secure the aircraft at all costs. This was no longer a mere piece of wreckage, it was a state secret that had fallen into their laps. The recovery operation was a feat of German logistical efficiency. A team of specialists from the Zentrale für Flugzeugentwicklung, Center for Aircraft Development, was dispatched from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing and evaluation center. They arrived at the French field to find Slick Chick sitting forlornly, like a beached whale. Their initial, on-site assessment was one of stunned disbelief. The damage from the landing was remarkably superficial: a collapsed gear, some torn skin. The airframe itself was sound. The engine, though terminally damaged internally, was a complete unit. Most importantly, the advanced systems, the radio, the gun sight, and most tantalizingly, the complex network of ducts and machinery mounted in the rear fuselage, were all present and mostly undamaged. Their real shock, however, came from the aircraft's construction. Using wrenches from their toolkit, they began removing panels. They expected the intricate, lightweight structures of their own aircraft. Instead, they found a brute strength that was almost alien to them. The longerons were not delicate trusses but beefy, solid members. The skin was thick, the rivets robust. One of the engineers, a man named Dr. Ernst Schreiber, who had worked on the delicate airframe of the Bf 109, was heard to mutter, "It is not an airplane, it is a flying panzer." This was not an insult, but a statement of awe. They were looking at an engineering philosophy made manifest in aluminum and steel. The process of moving the behemoth began. The wings were carefully detached. The massive, 12-ton bulk of the fuselage was hoisted onto a specially reinforced trailer, shrouded under a heavy tarpaulin. Under heavy guard, the convoy began a slow, nerve-wracking journey across the French countryside and into Germany, a constant prey to the ever-present threat of Allied fighter bombers patrolling the skies. Every checkpoint, every rail transfer, was handled with the utmost secrecy. The existence of this prize was known only to a select few. Finally, their components passed through the guarded gates of the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing facility on the shores of Lake Müritz. Here, in the very heart of German aeronautical science, the Thunderbolt was reassembled with clinical precision in a secluded hangar, far from prying eyes. It stood there, under the harsh electric lights, an alien artifact in a shrine to a different god. The swastika on its tail, painted over the American star, was a symbol of its capture, but it did nothing to diminish the latent power the machine seemed to exude. The engineers and pilots of Rechlin, the high priests of German aviation, now gathered around this strange, brutish idol. Their mission was simple, yet monumental: to dissect it, to understand its secrets, and to uncover the weaknesses of this American Goliath. They approached it with the confidence of masters dissecting a student's work. They were about to begin an education they would never forget. The hangar at Rechlin was a cathedral of German aeronautics, a vast, high-ceilinged space that usually echoed with the refined purr of Daimler-Benz engines and the clipped, technical language of the diplom engineers. But today, the space felt different, smaller somehow. The air, thick with the smells of oil, metal, and damp concrete, was now charged with a palpable sense of anticipation and disbelief. In the center of the hangar, under the stark, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights, stood the reassembled Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. And it dominated the room not through elegance, but through sheer, overwhelming physical presence. The German evaluation team, a mix of senior engineers, metallurgists, and handpicked Luftwaffe test pilots, formed a silent, slowly moving circle around the aircraft. They were the best and brightest of the Reich's aviation elite, men who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of aerodynamic perfection. They had come to dissect a curiosity, but they found themselves in the presence of a behemoth. The initial, stunned silence was broken only by the scuff of leather soles on concrete and the occasional, low murmur of astonishment. Hauptmann Erich Sommer, a decorated test pilot with hundreds of combat and evaluation hours in everything from the nimble Bf 109 to the revolutionary Me 262, was the first to voice the collective shock. He walked up to the fuselage, his head tilting back to take in its height. He reached out and, almost involuntarily, rapped his knuckles against the skin of the fuselage. The sound was not the thin, tinny ring of the Messerschmitt, but a solid, dull thud. "Mein Gott," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It is not an airplane. It is a fortified bank vault with wings." His comment, though made in jest, cut to the core of their disbelief. The data they had been given was one thing, a cold statistic on a page listing their weight as over 7 tons. But to stand next to it, to feel its immensity, was something else entirely. The Thunderbolt's fuselage was a massive cylinder, a brute force solution to housing the enormous radial engine. The wings were not the slender, graceful sweeps of a falcon, but thick, sturdy slabs, designed not just for lift but to serve as robust fuel tanks and the mounting point for 8 heavy machine guns. The propeller blades were like polished oars. Every component, from the landing gear struts to the canopy frame, seemed to have been designed with a single, uncompromising philosophy: bigger, stronger, heavier. The lead engineer, Dr. Friedrich Weber, a man whose life's work was shaving grams from airframe designs, circled the aircraft with a look of profound consternation. He carried a clipboard, but it hung limply at his side. "Their weight," he said, addressing no one in particular. "The empty weight is greater than the loaded weight of a 109. The physics, it makes no sense. The wing loading must be catastrophic. It would fall out of the sky like a stone." This was the source of their initial, profound skepticism. Their entire understanding of air combat was predicated on agility. A fighter's worth was measured by its rate of climb, its turning radius, its ability to outmaneuver an opponent in a high G dance of death. The Bf-109, for all its faults, was a master of this domain. It could climb like a homesick angel and turn inside almost anything the Allies could field. Standing before the P-47, they applied this same logic, and their conclusion was inescapable: this American machine was a failure. Sommer, putting himself in the mind of a pilot, voiced the tactical dismissal. "Look at it," he said, a confident smirk returning to his face. "A target like this. You would not need to be a marksman. You could hit it from a kilometer away. And in a turning fight." He made a tight, spiraling motion with his hand. "A single, hard turn, and this jug would stall, wallow, and present its broadside to you. It would be like a bull trying to catch a matador. It is powerful, yes, but slow and stupid." The other pilots nodded in agreement. They began to their eyes, their confidence buoyed by their own technical paradigm. They concluded it must be a ground attack aircraft, misclassified as a fighter. Perhaps it was intended to destroy trains and trucks, a role where its weight and armament might be an asset. But as a pure fighter, a hunter of other aircraft, it was deemed a clumsy, misguided effort. It was, in their expert opinion, a product of a naive industrial power that understood mass production but not the finesse of aerial combat. They saw its size as a liability, its weight as a fatal flaw. They had not yet looked past the surface. They had not yet crawled inside the engine cowling to understand the purpose of all that mass. They had not yet contemplated the strategic, rather than purely tactical, role of an aircraft. They were still judging the anvil by the standards of the scalpel. The hangar doors were closed, the detailed dissection was about to begin. They would soon move from the tarmac impressions to the cold, hard reality of the machine's internal secrets. And with every bolt they loosened, every panel they removed, their smug certainty would begin to erode, replaced by a dawning and unsettling realization: the Americans were not playing the same game. They had not built a better matador, they had built a force of nature against which no elegant capework would suffice. The dismissal that had begun on the tarmac was now to be tested in the clinical environment of the engine workshop. The German team, armed with their precision tools and a methodology honed on the intricate, liquid-cooled V12s of Daimler-Benz and Junkers, approached the front of the P-47 with a sense of procedural curiosity. Their first task was to remove the cowling and expose the beast's heart, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine. It was a moment they anticipated would confirm their suspicions of American crudeness. Instead, it became the first step in a profound and humbling education. The process of removing the cowling itself was their initial clue. It was not a complex puzzle of delicate, interlocking panels like those on a Bf-109. It was a robust, straightforward structure, secured by heavy-duty fasteners. As the last panel came away, the engine was revealed, and a collective, sharp intake of breath filled the workspace. The sheer physical volume of the double wasp was staggering. It was not merely an engine, it was a mechanical fortress, a two-row, 18-cylinder radial that filled the entire nose of the aircraft, a dense, intricate sculpture of cylinders, pushrods, and cooling fins. Dr. Weber, who had spent years perfecting their compact, lightweight DB605, stepped closer, his eyes tracing the engine's architecture. The displacement, he murmured, almost to himself. 2,800 cubic inches, over 46 liters. The number was incomprehensible in the context of fighter design. A single one of its cylinders had nearly the displacement of an entire German motorcycle engine. This was not engineering finesse, this was engineering by overwhelming force. The disassembly began in earnest, and with each component they removed, the German team's perspective shifted from derision to a grudging, then outright awe. Their first major point of astonishment was the engine's sheer robustness. The cylinders were not lightweight aluminum assemblies but massive, forged steel units, thick-walled and built to withstand phenomenal internal pressures. The crankshaft was a component of locomotive-like proportions, a solid, unforgiving piece of steel that seemed to laugh at the concept of mechanical failure. Where a German engine was a watch, the R-2800 was a bank vault's time lock. This is not designed for peak performance, one of the junior engineers noted, holding a valve spring that was twice the size of its German equivalent. It is designed to survive. Nein, Weber corrected, his voice low and intense. You are mistaken. This is its performance. Its peak performance is reliability. Look at the tolerances. He pointed to the piston rings. They are generous. They are designed to accommodate thermal expansion, foreign object damage, and imperfect maintenance. Our engines must be built and maintained in sterile conditions. This engine, he said, tapping the massive crankcase with a knuckle, could be assembled in a dust storm and still run. The concept was revolutionary to them. German engineering sought to eliminate all slack, all imperfection, to create a perfect, seamless machine. The R-2800 embraced a margin of safety so vast it seemed wasteful, but in that waste lay its genius. It could ingest dirt, suffer minor coolant leaks, and tolerate over-revving that would have shattered the more highly-strung German power plants. It was, they realized, an engine for a war of attrition, where the ability to keep flying was more valuable than achieving a perfect power-to-weight ratio on a test stand. Their analysis then turned to the cooling system. The German liquid-cooled engines, with their vulnerable radiators and complex plumbing, were a constant source of vulnerability. A single rifle bullet in a coolant line could spell doom. The R-2800 was air-cooled, a fact the Germans had initially dismissed as primitive. But as they studied the intricate baffling and the precisely engineered airflow around each cylinder, they realized it was a masterpiece of thermodynamics. It had no vulnerable radiator to puncture, no fragile hoses to burst. It could take battle damage that would have instantly disabled a Daimler-Benz engine and continue to run. Its cylinders dissipating heat into the massive airstream forced through the cowling. Hauptmann Sommer, watching the disassembly, began to see the tactical implications. A pilot does not need to fear a shot to the cooling system, he observed, a note of respect creeping into his voice. He can take a hit and keep fighting. In a dogfight, that is a psychological weapon. Our pilots are trained to protect the radiator. Their pilots are not. He was beginning to understand. The Americans had not just built an engine, they had built a shield. They had traded a slight aerodynamic penalty for an almost unbelievable level of battlefield resilience. By the time the R-2800 was fully disassembled, laid out across several workbenches like the dissected parts of a mechanical god, the mood in the hangar had transformed. The initial skepticism was gone, replaced by a sober, almost grim appreciation. They had come to mock a blunt instrument and had instead found a masterpiece of a different kind. The Thunderbolt's heart was not a refined, high-strung racing engine. It was a diesel-like workhorse, a power plant of immense, unyielding strength, designed not for a brief, brilliant sprint, but for a long, brutal marathon. It was the heart of an aircraft built not just to fight, but to endure. And for the first time, the German engineers were forced to confront a terrifying question: what if, in the vast, sprawling conflict they now faced, endurance was a far more valuable quality than brilliance? The disassembly of the P-47 had proceeded with a methodical, clinical rhythm. The Germans had mapped the airframe, catalogued the robust landing gear, and stood in awe of the R-2800's raw power. Yet, a fundamental puzzle remained unsolved, a piece of the equation that, in their minds, did not add up. They had measured the Thunderbolt's weight, they had calculated its drag, and they knew the power output of its engine. According to their own aerodynamic models, an aircraft of this bulk should have been a sluggish, medium-altitude performer, unable to effectively engage high-flying bombers or the fighters sent to protect them. Yet, intelligence reports and frantic pilot accounts spoke of a different reality, a reality where the P-47 possessed shocking performance in the thin, cold air above 25,000 feet, a realm where even the specialized high-altitude Bf-109G struggled to breathe. It was during the dissection of the rear fuselage, behind the pilot's armor plate and the main fuel tank, that they found the answer. And it was a revelation that dwarfed even the shock of the massive radial engine. The process began with the removal of the fuselage panels. What they expected to find was a simple framework of longerons and stringers, perhaps housing radio equipment or ammunition boxes. Instead, their tools revealed an incredibly dense, intricate labyrinth of machinery and ductwork. It was a tightly packed, almost impossibly complex system that seemed more akin to the inner workings of a chemical plant than an aircraft. At its center, mounted just ahead of the tail wheel, was a large, turbine-driven unit, connected to the engine by a long, tubular driveshaft that ran underneath the cockpit. A network of large-diameter ducts snaked around it, one leading forward to scoop air, the other leading back to the engine's intake. For a long moment, the engineers simply stared, their minds struggling to categorize what they were seeing. It was Dr. Weber who broke the silence, his voice a hushed whisper of disbelief. A turbo later, a turbo supercharger, he said, the word feeling foreign and immense in the hangar air. They have put an entire power station in the tail. The concept of forced induction was not new to the Germans. Their own engines used mechanical superchargers, gear-driven impellers housed within the engine itself, to compress thin air for high-altitude performance. But these systems had inherent limitations. They were directly tied to engine RPM, sapping significant horsepower to drive them, and they could only be optimized for a specific altitude band. A Bf-109 pilot might have to choose between a supercharger setting for medium altitude and one for high altitude, each with a dramatic performance trade-off. The American solution was one of breathtaking ambition and engineering elegance. They had decoupled the supercharger from the engine. The P-47 system used the engine's own exhaust gases, which would normally be wasted, to spin a powerful turbine. This turbine, via the long driveshaft, powered a centrifugal supercharger compressor mounted at the rear of the aircraft. The compressed, dense air was then fed forward through an intercooler, another component that drew astonished gazes, to cool it and increase its density even further, before being piped all the way back to the engine's intake manifold. The implications unfolded in the minds of the German engineers like a series of devastating explosions. First, there was efficiency. The system ran on waste energy. It robbed minimal power from the engine itself, unlike their own gear-driven systems which could consume hundreds of horsepower. This meant nearly all of the R-2800's colossal output was delivered to the propeller. Second, there was consistency. The turbocharger was regulated by an intricate, yet robust, automatic control unit that constantly adjusted the wastegate to maintain perfect manifold pressure from ground level up to over 35,000 feet. While a German pilot was manually switching supercharger gears and watching his power fade at the edges of his altitude band, the American pilot simply pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt maintained its full, devastating power across an astonishingly wide flight envelope. It did not suffer, it thrived where other aircraft gasped for breath. Hauptmann Sommer, the test pilot, immediately grasped the tactical revolution. He visualized the battlefield. Our fighters, we climbed to intercept the bombers. It is a slow, difficult process. We reach our operational ceiling, our engines are straining, our propellers biting at thin air. And then they arrive. He pointed at the exposed turbocharger. They are not straining. They are at full power. They have the energy to dive, to climb, to fight with full maneuverability. We are at our limit, and for them, it is just another day's work. The final, humbling realization was one of trade-offs. The German philosophy was to minimize drag and weight at all costs. The Americans, they now saw, had made a calculated, brilliant trade. They had accepted the weight and complexity of this massive, rear-mounted system, the long, vulnerable driveshaft, the extensive ductwork, the heavy intercooler, in exchange for a qualitative advantage that redefined high-altitude combat. They had traded a minor penalty in low-altitude agility for an overwhelming dominance at the altitude where the strategic war was being fought. The team worked in a near silence for the rest of the day, their earlier confidence utterly evaporated. They were no longer examining a clumsy brute, they were reverse engineering a system of genius. The Thunderbolt was not a simple machine. It was two power plants in one, a massive piston engine in the front, and a jet-age gas turbine in the rear, working in perfect, automated harmony. The secret of its performance was no longer a secret. It was a physical, tangible truth lying exposed before them, a truth that demonstrated a level of systems integration and strategic foresight they had not believed their enemy possessed. The Jug was not just powerful, it was prescient. It was built for the very high altitude war the Germans were now losing, and in its intricate tail, they saw the blueprint of their own defeat in the air. The revelation of the turbo supercharger had redefined the Thunderbolt in the minds of the German engineers from a clumsy brute to a system of profound complexity. Yet, it was the subsequent, meticulous analysis of its basic airframe and protective features that completed a far more unsettling picture. They had uncovered the machine's genius, now, they were about to comprehend its soul. The P-47 was not merely designed to fight, it was engineered to endure, to absorb a level of punishment that would have vaporized any of their own creations. It was, they came to realize, less a fighter plane and more a flying fortress in a single-engine package. The process began with a detailed structural assessment. Having fully exposed the airframe, Dr. Weber and his team subjected its components to every test they could devise short of destructive analysis. They measured the thickness of the aluminum skin, finding it to be substantially heavier gauge than that of a Bf-109 or FW-190. They scrutinized the main spar of the wing, a structure they expected to be a complex, lightweight truss. Instead, they found a massive, almost brutish I-beam construction. An engineer tasked with calculating load factors looked up from his slide rule, baffled. The safety margins, he reported to Weber, they are extravagant. It is as if they designed it to withstand forces 3 times greater than any pilot could survive. This was not inefficiency, it was a fundamental tenet of the American design philosophy. The airframe's ruggedness was a prerequisite for its most devastating tactical asset, the dive. Reports from the front now took on a new, terrifying clarity. Pilots spoke of the Thunderbolt entering a dive that no German aircraft could follow, a near-vertical plunge where it would accelerate to speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. The Germans now understood why. This airframe, this anvil, was the only thing that could withstand the immense aerodynamic forces of such a maneuver without ripping itself apart. Their own lighter, more delicate fighters were physically prohibited from matching it, their wings threatening to detach if they tried. The Thunderbolt's weight, once a source of mockery, was now understood as the bedrock of its most lethal maneuver. Next, their investigation turned to the fuel system. They carefully extracted one of the main fuel cells from the wing. From the outside, it appeared to be a simple rubberized bladder. But their internal examination revealed its secret. A junior engineer, making a precise incision, exposed a layered matrix of untreated, raw rubber and woven canvas. Weber picked up a sample, pressing the thick, pliable material between his fingers. Self-sealing, he announced, a note of grim admiration in his voice. The principle is simple, but the execution is perfect. When a projectile punctures the tank, the fuel itself reacts with this rubber compound. It swells, it closes the hole. It is not instantaneous magic, but it is remarkably effective. He contrasted this with the standard German practice of using pressurized inert gas to fill empty fuel tank space, a system that was complex, added weight, and was far less effective against larger caliber hits. The American solution was elegantly pragmatic, a passive system that required no pilot input, no complex plumbing. It simply worked, turning what should have been a catastrophic fireball into a manageable leak. This single feature, they knew, was responsible for saving countless American pilots and returning hundreds of aircraft to the fight. The final piece of the survivability puzzle was the cockpit armor. They measured the thick steel plate behind the pilot's seat, a slab that could deflect 20mm cannon shells. They noted the bulletproof glass of the windscreen, far thicker than their own. But it was the integration of these features that was most telling. The pilot was nestled in a protective cocoon, surrounded by the massive structural members of the fuselage, with the armored engine block in front of him and the armored plate behind him. Their vital components, the turbocharger system in the rear, the oil and coolant systems, were distributed and shielded, ensuring that a single, lucky hit was unlikely to destroy the entire aircraft. Hauptmann Sommer spent a long time sitting in the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the controls. The perspective was different from the cockpit of his 109. Here, he was not perched in a glass canopy at the very front of a delicate frame, he was seated deep within a robust, armored shell. He felt, for the first time, a sense of profound security. "This is not just about surviving a crash," he said, emerging from the cockpit to address the engineers. "This is about surviving the fight. Our pilots are taught that to be hit is to be killed. Their pilots are taught that to be hit is an inconvenience. Do you understand the psychological difference? A pilot who knows his aircraft can bring him home even when it is full of holes will take risks, will press an attack, will stay in the fight longer. Our pilots must break off at the first sign of damage. Theirs do not." This was the ultimate, chilling realization. The Thunderbolt's survivability was not a passive quality, it was an active tactical weapon. It bred aggression and confidence. It allowed for tactics that were predicated on absorbing a first blow in order to deliver a killing counterpunch. The reports of P-47s returning to base with entire sections of wing missing, with hundreds of holes punched through their airframes, were not mere propaganda, they were the logical outcome of this design philosophy. As they reassembled the airframe, the German team worked in a somber mood. They had come to evaluate a fighter and had instead autopsied a phenomenon. The Thunderbolt was a machine that traded a slight penalty in one narrow aspect of performance, low-altitude turning, for an overwhelming advantage in every facet that mattered in a long, brutal war of attrition, power, high-altitude performance, and, most critically, the ability to simply, stubbornly, refuse to die. They had built scalpels, honed to a perfect, razor's edge. But you cannot kill an anvil with a scalpel. You can only break your blade against it, again and again, until you have nothing left. The dissection of the Thunderbolt's airframe and powerplant had forced a grudging respect from the German engineers. They had transitioned from seeing a clumsy brute to understanding a deeply sophisticated, if differently prioritized, weapons system. But it was when they turned their attention to the aircraft's armament that the theoretical advantages of American design philosophy became terrifyingly tangible. The evaluation of the P-47's firepower was not a matter of analyzing complex mechanisms, it was a stark lesson in applied brute force, a calculation of sheer destructive potential that left the Germans deeply unsettled. The process began with the removal of the wing panels, revealing the Thunderbolt's most iconic feature, the 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. They were mounted in a tightly packed battery, 4 in each wing, nestled within the thick, load-bearing structure. To the German eye, accustomed to the mixed armament of cannon and machine guns that was the European standard, the sight was both perplexing and impressive in its simplicity. "Act stuck," one of the armorists muttered, shaking his head. 8. They have given it the firepower of a heavy ground vehicle. Dr. Weber approached the exposed installation, his engineer's mind immediately analyzing the layout. The synchronization of the feed chutes, the robust mounting points that could handle the gun's formidable recoil, the easy access panels designed for rapid rearming and clearing of jams in the field, it was a system built for volume and reliability. He compared it silently to the armament of a Bf-109. The German fighter typically carried a pair of 7.92mm 17 machine guns above the engine and a 20mm FF M cannon firing through the propeller hub. The cannon was a powerful weapon, but its rate of fire was slow, its ammunition supply limited, and its muzzle velocity relatively low, making it a poor choice for deflection shooting against a maneuvering target. The rifle-caliber machine guns were largely ineffective against the rugged structures of American bombers. They have chosen a single solution for all problems, Weber observed, his tone clinical but his eyes betraying a hint of unease. No mixing of ammunition types. No complex synchronization between cannon and machine gun trajectories. Just volume. This was the core of the American approach. The .50 caliber BMG, Browning machine gun, round was a masterpiece of destructive compromise. It was not the high-explosive sledgehammer of a 20mm or 30mm cannon shell, but it was for more than a rifle bullet. The junior engineers were tasked with analyzing the ammunition. They weighed the heavy, half-inch diameter projectiles, the standard M2 armor-piercing, the M8 incendiary, and the devastating M23 incendiary tracer. They calculated the muzzle velocity, the kinetic energy delivered on target, and the astonishing rate of fire. The numbers were staggering. A single P-47 could put over 100 rounds per second downrange, a solid stream of lead and fire. The cumulative effect was not a series of individual punctures, it was a soaring, shredding force. An engineer who had studied damage reports from the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe had faced the similarly armed P-39 Airacobra, provided context. It is not about a single, killing blow, he explained to the group. It is about saturation. Our 20mm cannon can destroy a component with one hit, if it hits the right component. But these .50 caliber guns, they do not need to be precise. They cut control cables, they puncture cylinders, they shred the wing root, they start fires with the incendiary rounds. They do not snipe the engine, they bludgeon the entire airframe into submission. Hauptmann Sommer, the test pilot, listened to this analysis with a growing sense of dread. He mentally superimposed this flying battery onto the tactical scenarios he knew so well. In a deflection shot, he said, you have a fleeting moment, a fraction of a second to aim. With a cannon, you must be perfect. Your 1 or 2 shots must strike a vital area. With this, he gestured at the 8 barrels, you simply point the aircraft in the general direction and hose the area. Your margin of error is enormous. A novice pilot has a chance to inflict fatal damage where an ace in a 109 might miss. This was the democratization of air-to-air destruction. The American system was designed to make every pilot, not just the marksman, lethal. Furthermore, the concentration of all guns in the wings eliminated the complex synchronization gear required for engine-mounted weapons, simplifying manufacture and maintenance while ensuring a perfectly convergent stream of fire at a predetermined range. The final, sobering realization was one of logistics and sustainability. The German reliance on 20mm and 30mm cannon shells meant producing complex fuses, high-explosive fillers, and intricate brass casings. The American .50 caliber round was a sturdy, simple, massively produced cartridge. Its production lines were the same that fed the machine guns of infantry, tanks, and naval vessels. The entire Allied war machine ran on this single, ubiquitous caliber. They have turned mass production into a weapon itself, Weber concluded, the full strategic picture now coming into a devastating focus. They have chosen a weapon that is good enough to destroy most targets, and then they have built an aircraft that can carry it in overwhelming quantities, and an industrial base that can produce it by the millions. It is not elegant. But it is terrifyingly efficient. As they closed the wing panels, the image of the 8 silent gun muzzles remained seared in their minds. The Thunderbolt was no longer just a durable, high-altitude platform. It was a flying battleship, a distributor of orchestrated violence on an industrial scale. The Germans had built fighters that delivered surgical strikes. The Americans had built a fighter that delivered a torrent of fire, a hailstorm of metal that could wash away an enemy through sheer, undiluted volume. It was another facet of the same, unyielding philosophy, why finesse a single kill when you could unleash a tempest? The hangar at Rechlin had been a classroom of disassembly, a place of theoretical shock and grudging admiration. But an aircraft's true soul is only revealed in its native element, the sky. For Hauptmann Erich Sommer, the designated test pilot, the upcoming flight was more than a routine evaluation. It was a journey into the mind of an enemy, a chance to feel the philosophy of American engineering through the control stick and the seat of his pants. The ground crew had done their work. The captured Thunderbolt, now bearing makeshift German markings over its olive drab paint, was fueled, armed with instrumentation, and ready. As Sommer strapped himself into the surprisingly roomy cockpit, he felt a mixture of professional curiosity and the faint, cold trace of apprehension. The startup procedure was straightforward, the big Pratt & Whitney R2800 rumbling to life with a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the entire airframe, a sound utterly different from the high-pitched whine of the Daimler-Benz. The takeoff roll was long, the heavy aircraft feeling planted and deliberate as it gathered speed, but once the tail came up and the massive propeller bit into the air, it lifted off with a surprising sense of purpose. His initial impressions as he climbed away from Rechlin confirmed some of the German prejudices. The climb rate was respectable, but it was no rocket ship like the Leighton Bf-109G. It felt like what it was, a very heavy machine muscling its way upward, its great weight a constant opponent to its tremendous power. Then he leveled off at 20,000 feet, pushed the throttle forward, and began the real evaluation. The first thing that struck him was the controls. They were heavy, especially the ailerons. This was no flick roll fighter. But as he banked the aircraft into a turn, he discovered something unexpected. While initiating the roll required significant muscle, the roll rate itself, once started, was crisp and authoritative. The sheer leverage of the large ailerons on the robust wing began to overcome the inertia of the airframe. It was not agile, but it was solid. He then tried a series of gentle S-turns, feeling for stability. This was his second shock. The P-47 was like a rock. It tracked with unwavering precision. He could take his hands off the stick, and it would fly straight and level, barely deviating. He immediately understood the implication: this was the most stable gun platform he had ever flown. In a gunnery pass, a pilot would not be fighting his own aircraft to keep the sights on target. The aircraft would do it for him, allowing for aimed, sustained fire from its 8 heavy machine guns. He continued his climb, pushing towards 30,000 feet. This was where the German fighters began to feel anemic, their mechanical superchargers struggling to compress the thin air, their controls becoming mushy. But in the Thunderbolt, the opposite was happening. The automatic turbo supercharger, that masterpiece of engineering he had seen in the hangar, was doing its work. The manifold pressure remained strong, the engine power unwavering. At an altitude where a Bf-109 would be gasping, the P-47 felt like it was just hitting its stride. It was a disorienting, almost unnatural feeling, full power in a realm where flight should be a struggle. Then came the moment of truth. Sommer picked a landmark on the ground, checked his altimeter, and pushed the control stick forward. The response was instantaneous and violent. The nose dropped as if drawn by a magnet. The airspeed began to build at a rate that was simply alien to his experience. The wind scream rose to a shrieking roar. He was pressed into his harness as the G-forces mounted. A glance at the airspeed indicator showed the needle sweeping past 450, 500, heading towards 550 miles per hour. There was no buffeting, no vibration, no sensation of the airframe coming apart. The Thunderbolt felt as solid as a train on rails, plunging earthward with an elemental force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. This was the ultimate expression of its weight and strength. The very mass that had made it sluggish in the climb was now converting into unstoppable kinetic energy. No German fighter, with its lighter, more delicate structure, could follow. To attempt it would mean seeing their wings fold back like paper. He initiated the pull-out, a slow, steady, but immense application of back pressure on the stick. The G-forces squeezed the air from his lungs, but the airframe responded without a groan, arcing smoothly out of the dive. He had just demonstrated the Thunderbolt's ultimate trump card, the ability to dictate the terms of any engagement. It could not be caught in a dive, and it could use that dive to convert altitude into speed for a slashing attack or a rapid disengagement. Returning to lower altitude, Summer decided to test its low-speed handling. As he slowed the aircraft, it began to feel its weight again, becoming stolid and unresponsive. In a low-speed turning fight with a Focke-Wulf 190, he knew the P-47 would be at a grave disadvantage. But as he recovered and lined up for the landing approach, the final piece of the tactical puzzle clicked into place. The Americans had never intended for this aircraft to turn and burn with its enemies. That was a fool's game. The Thunderbolt's doctrine was one of energy management: use its high-altitude performance to hold the advantage, its dive to attack or escape, and its ruggedness to survive when the fight became a brawl. It was a pilot's aircraft not in the sense of requiring delicate touch, but in the sense of demanding tactical discipline and foresight. As he taxied the rumbling beast back to its hangar, shutting down the mighty double wasp, a profound silence descended, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. He unstrapped and climbed out, his mind racing. The engineers gathered around, eager for his report. He looked at Dr. Weber, his face a mask of sober realization. "It is not what we thought," Summer began, his voice quiet but firm. "It is not a dogfighter. It is a strategic fighter. Its weapon is not just its guns, but its performance envelope. At our best altitudes, it is powerful. At its best altitudes, we are helpless. It cannot turn with us, but it does not need to. It simply dives away, and we cannot follow. And in a head-on pass, with that stable platform and those 8 guns, he trailed off, the implication clear. The flight had proven that the P-47's true genius lay not in excelling at the existing rules of air combat, but in rewriting them. It was a brute, yes, but a brute of terrifying intelligence, one that had rendered a significant portion of the Luftwaffe's tactical playbook obsolete. In the air, it was no longer a question of if the German pilots were better. It was a question of whether their skill could overcome a machine that had been designed to operate on an entirely different, and brutally effective, set of physical and tactical principles. The air in the office was thick, stale with the scent of cold coffee, cheap tobacco, and the faint, metallic tang of anxiety. Before Oberst Wilhelm Fogel, the lead engineer of the Evaluation Commission, lay the culmination of weeks of intense, soul-searching work, the final draft of the technical report on the Flugzeug P-47 Thunderbolt. The stack of papers, dense with typed observations, graphs, and performance charts, felt heavier than the tank armor he was more accustomed to assessing. He picked up his pen, a familiar instrument he had used to endorse the blueprints of Germany's aerial predators, and prepared to use it now to describe an enemy machine that had systematically dismantled their professional arrogance. He began to write, his script precise and sharp, each word a small battle against a deeply ingrained paradigm. Subject: technical and tactical evaluation of captured U.S. fighter aircraft P-47D Thunderbolt. 2. Reich Air Ministry, Office of Aircraft Development. From Oberst Wilhelm Fogel, Engineering Evaluation Group, Rechlin. The header was a formality. The body of the text was a confession. The initial external assessment of the P-47D, he wrote, confirmed our tactical preconceptions. Its silhouette is massive and utilitarian, presenting a larger target profile than our designs. Its weight, nearly double that of a Bf-109, suggested poor climb performance and low-speed agility, which subsequent flight testing confirmed. In a low-altitude, turning engagement, our fighters maintain a clear and decisive advantage. He could almost hear the readers in Berlin, the generals and ministry officials, nodding in satisfaction. This was the narrative they expected. But this was where the report pivoted, where the uncomfortable truths, meticulously documented, began to bleed through. However, Fogel underlined the word, pressing down hard enough to slightly tear the paper. A comprehensive analysis reveals a design philosophy so fundamentally alien to our own that it necessitates a complete re-evaluation of our definition of an effective fighter aircraft. The Americans have not built a better dogfighter, they have built a superior high-altitude, high-energy weapons system. Their priorities are not finesse, but force, not complexity, but resilience. He moved to the section on the power plant. His mind flashed to the disassembled R-2800, its cylinders like forge-hardened steel pots. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine is not a precision instrument, he continued, It is an industrial power plant. Its design prioritizes massive displacement and robust construction over lightweight complexity. While our engines achieve high power-to-weight ratios through intricate mechanical systems, the R2800 achieves reliability through over-engineering and generous tolerances. It is an engine that can sustain battle damage and imperfect maintenance that would permanently disable a Daimler-Benz 605. This is not a technical failing, it is a strategic choice for a war of attrition. Then came the turbocharger. This was the heart of their shock, the piece of engineering that redefined the battlefield. The most significant technical revelation is the General Electric turbo supercharging system, Vogel wrote, his pen moving with grim purpose. This is not a simple mechanical supercharger, but a complex, exhaust-driven system mounted in the rear fuselage. Its effect is revolutionary. While our fighters suffer a critical loss of power above 7,000 meters, the P-47 maintains full military power to altitudes in excess of 10,000 meters. This gives it an insurmountable energy advantage in the engagement zone of our bomber formations. Our pilots are fighting at their physiological and mechanical limits. The American pilot is operating within his aircraft's optimal performance envelope. He detailed the flight test results, channeling Hauptmann Sommer's sobering debrief. Flight performance confirms this analysis. The aircraft's roll rate is surprisingly good, and its high-speed stability is exceptional, making it a near-perfect gun platform for its battery of 8.50 caliber machine guns. While it cannot turn with a FW-190, it does not need to. Its dive performance is catastrophic for our interceptors. Once it enters a vertical dive, no German aircraft can follow or escape. This allows it to dictate the terms of engagement absolutely. He arrived at the most profound, and for the German war effort, the most damning conclusion. It was no longer about individual components, but about the system. In conclusion, Vogel wrote, his hand now steady, the fight gone out of him. The P-47D represents a holistic design approach perfectly suited to the strategic reality it faces. Its rugged airframe and extensive armor protection grant it survivability that borders on the phenomenal. Its mechanical simplicity and modular construction allow for rapid repair and high operational readiness rates. Its armament, while ballistically inferior to cannon, delivers a volume of fire that guarantees destruction through saturation. He took a final, deep breath, the totality of their findings crystallizing into a single, devastating paragraph. We are forced to concede that while we have pursued and achieved technical excellence in individual components, the Americans have mastered the system. They have created an aircraft that is less a finely tuned instrument and more relentless, durable, and overwhelmingly powerful machine. It is built not for the perfect duel, but for the long, grinding campaign. It is a weapon of industrial warfare, and in this regard, it is superior. We have never built, and under our current industrial and philosophical constraints, cannot build, a fighter with this combination of high-altitude power, survivability, and strategic reliability. The technical report from Rechlin was a damning document, a clinical autopsy of a singular machine that revealed a catastrophic strategic disease. But the true, soul-crushing weight of the evaluation did not lie in the performance charts of 1P-47, it lay in the chilling implication whispered between every line of the report: this was not an anomaly. The Thunderbolt was not a handcrafted masterpiece, a technological one-off like their own Me-262. It was an artifact, a single, mass-produced cog in a machine of such immense scale and efficiency that the German mind, trained in the school of quality and precision, struggled to fully comprehend it. The engineers at Rechlin had dissected the what, it was now the task of the strategists to understand the how many. The power of the P-47 was not merely the 2,000-plus horsepower of its double Wasp engine. That was a tangible, measurable force. The true power was abstract, logarithmic, and lay in the sprawling factories of the Republic Aviation Corporation in Farmingdale, New York, and later in Evansville, Indiana. It was the power of American production, a force that transformed the qualitative advantage of a single aircraft into an quantitative, and ultimately unstoppable, avalanche. While German aircraft plants, often hidden in forests or dispersed to evade bomber raids, operated like elite workshops, the American plants were cathedrals of volume. The imagery was stark. On one side, skilled German technicians painstakingly fitting complex components for a Focke-Wulf FW-190, a process bottlenecked by the scarcity of specialized parts and the constant threat of disruption. On the other, mile-long assembly lines where P-47s, hundreds at a time, moved in a relentless, orderly procession. The scale was not merely larger, it was of a different dimension. The Germans, through intelligence reports and their own analysis, came to understand the principles that made this possible. It was the same philosophy they had seen in the tank's robust construction and the engine's generous tolerances, applied now to the entire manufacturing process: standardization, simplification, and scale. Standardization meant that a Thunderbolt built in New York was functionally identical to one built in Indiana. Every part was interchangeable. This was not the case in the German system, where late-war desperation and resource shortages led to constant design revisions and field modifications, creating a logistical nightmare for maintenance and supply. An American mechanic needed only one manual, one set of tools, and one bin of spare parts to service any P-47 in the European theater. Simplification was the key to speed. The P-47 was designed for production. Its parts were made with an eye towards easy machining and assembly. The airframe, while robust, used large, straightforward components that could be stamped, riveted, and assembled by a workforce comprising thousands of men and women who had never built an aircraft before the war. This stood in stark contrast to the intricate, almost artistic construction of a German fighter, which required highly trained machinists and fitters. Scale was the final, overwhelming multiplier. The numbers, when laid side by side, told a story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the year the P-47 reached its peak operational strength, Republic Aviation produced over 6,000 Thunderbolts. For context, the entire German aviation industry, across all manufacturers and under the constant hammer of Allied bombing, managed to produce just over 13,000 single-engine fighters of all types that same year. The United States was producing nearly one specialized, high-performance fighter for every two produced by the entire Reich. The P-47 alone was being built at a rate that could replace its entire combat losses several times over, while simultaneously expanding the fleet. This production miracle had a direct and devastating impact on the battlefield, measurable in a single, critical metric: operational readiness. A German Jagdgeschwader, fighter wing, might start a major defensive operation with 90 aircraft on its roster. After a week of intense combat, losses and, more insidiously, mechanical failures would whittle that number down to 20 or 30 serviceable machines. The delicate nature of their high-strung engines and complex systems meant they spent more time in the maintenance hangar than in the air. An American fighter group, by contrast, would begin with 75 P-47s. After the same week of brutal combat, it might have lost 15 aircraft, but thanks to the robust reliability of the design and the flood of replacement parts and even whole new aircraft from across the Atlantic, it would still field 60 or more operational fighters. The frontline strength was not only maintained, it could grow. This was their unbeatable combination, a machine that was both formidable in combat and readily available to combat. The P-47, therefore, was more than a weapon. It was a physical manifestation of American industrial might. Every Thunderbolt that appeared over Berlin was not just a fighter plane, it was a statement. It declared that for every complex, hand-finished German machine, America could produce 5 durable, effective ones. For every German pilot lost, America could train 3 more to fly in a cockpit designed for ease of use. For every airfield the Luftwaffe had to abandon, America could build a new one and stock it with fuel, bombs, and spare parts by the shipload. The report from Rechlin, in its dry, technical language, had inadvertently documented the end of an era. The age of the nightly jewel in the clouds was over, replaced by the age of the industrial tsunami. The Germans had mastered the art of building the perfect sword. The Americans had mastered the science of producing an endless supply of unstoppable hammers. And no matter how exquisite the sword, when faced with 10,000 hammers, the outcome was never in doubt. The power of the P-47 was not just in its engine or its turbocharger, it was in the relentless, rhythmic thunder of the production line, a sound that echoed all the way to the heart of the Reich, drowning out the last, fading hopes of victory. The thunder of the double Wasp engine faded from the European skies, and the jet age dawned with a shrill whine that promised a new, faster, deadlier form of air combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive, brutish jug, was seemingly rendered obsolete, a relic of a bygone conflict. Yet, its retirement from active service marked not an end, but the beginning of its most profound influence. The legacy of the Thunderbolt was not in its specific airframe, but in the revolutionary design philosophy it embodied, a philosophy that would be absorbed, studied, and ultimately woven into the DNA of post-war aviation, from the cockpits of Korea to the runways of today. In the immediate post-war years, the world's air forces, particularly the new United States Air Force, conducted a brutal audit of what had worked and what had failed. The lessons were clear. The pursuit of ultimate performance, as exemplified by the German jet and rocket fighters, was a dead end if it came at the cost of reliability, maintainability, and pilot survivability. The P-47 stood as the ultimate testament to the opposite approach. It had proven that winning a long war was not about building the perfect dueling weapon, but about building a sustainable, resilient system. This realization directly shaped the first generation of American jet fighters. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, while sleek and advanced, retained the Jug's core virtues. They were rugged, relatively simple to maintain, and provided their pilots with excellent visibility and a stable gun platform. The Sabre was a scalpel, but it was a scalpel forged on the anvil of the P-47's philosophy. The Thunderbolt's most direct and enduring legacy, however, lies in the realm of close air support. Their Jug ended the war as arguably the finest ground attack aircraft of the conflict, a role it had grown into with devastating effect. Its ability to absorb phenomenal punishment from ground fire, its stable dive characteristics, and its payload capacity, it could carry over half the bomb load of AB-17 Flying Fortress, made it a flying artillery piece without equal. This lesson was not forgotten. The USAF, recognizing the enduring need for a dedicated, survivable ground attack platform, essentially spent the next half-century trying to recreate the P-47 in various forms. The A-1 Sky Raider was a purposeful, piston-engine reincarnation, slower, but even more burdened with ordnance and endurance. Later, the A-10 Thunderbolt II would take the Jug's mantle explicitly, its very name a tribute to its legendary predecessor. The A-10, with its titanium bathtub protecting the pilot, its immense durability, and its overpowered, straightforward engines, is the spiritual successor to the P-47. It is a flying anvil, built to take hits and destroy tanks, embodying the same philosophy of survivability and focused purpose over sleek agility. Beyond specific aircraft lineages, the P-47's influence cemented fundamental principles in modern military procurement. The German evaluation at Rechlin had been a masterclass in the perils of over-engineering. The post-war world, especially the Western Bloc, internalized this. The concept of design for maintenance became paramount. The ease with which the P-47's power plant could be swapped, its accessible systems, and its standardized parts became the gold standard. Modern fighter aircraft, for all their incomprehensible complexity, are designed with modular components and line-replaceable units, LRUs, that allow for rapid repair and turnaround, a direct inheritance from the American industrial pragmatism the Jug represented. Furthermore, the Jug's legend validated the American approach to training and human factors. The aircraft was forgiving enough to allow a pilot with a year of training to become effective, and its survivability ensured he would live to become a veteran. This focus on reducing their skill floor while protecting the operator is now a cornerstone of modern weapons design, from attack helicopters to infantry combat vehicles. Today, the P-47's legacy is a dual one. In the halls of aviation museums, it sits as an icon of American industrial might, a symbol of the overwhelming force that helped crush the Axis. Its legend is not that of the graceful Spitfire or the sinister Me-262, it is the legend of the dependable workhorse, the unbreakable beast that always brought its pilots home. But in the design bureaus and military think tanks, its legacy is for more active. It serves as a perpetual reminder that technological sophistication must be balanced with practical reality. It argues that in their fog of war, the ability to keep fighting, to have your weapons systems operational, your pilots confident in their machine's resilience, and your logistics chain flowing, is a form of tactical and strategic power that often outweighs a marginal advantage on a performance chart. The Thunderbolt was never the perfect dogfighter. But in its rugged, unpretentious, and overwhelming form, it achieved something far greater. It became the perfect weapon for the war it was called to fight. It taught the world that in the grim arithmetic of conflict, 1,000 reliable sledgehammers are infinitely more valuable than a single, exquisite, and fragile scalpel. The Jug's thunder may have quieted, but its echo continues to shape the machines that rule the skies, a lasting testament to the enduring power of brute strength, smartly applied.